Thanks, Sonia, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be hosting this session on mastering tenancy schedule and clean up for effective model preparation. Um, we'll go through some common tips or mistakes that people make while preparing tenancy schedule, and I'll highlight some best practices that we can do, which would help us with seamless financial modeling. Uh, and the last 15 to 20 minutes, 15 minutes of the presentation, I will spend towards actually showing you how you can use the get data function from Excel to pull data from PDF. And once you've pulled tenancy schedule in a raw format, how can you further refine it to draw meaningful insights from it and get it ready for financial modeling purposes. Uh, Throughout the presentation, if you guys have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat bar, whether you are in Zoom or YouTube. So without wasting any further time, I'll move on to the next slide. So what is a tenancy schedule and why is it important? Tenancy schedule is a PDF or it can be spreadsheet details of all information, which is required to model our in-place income, the current rental income. The information can include vast amount of data ranging from name of the tenant, the flow they are on, the areas, the lease start date, lease end date, what is the current rent, when is the break date, when is the next rent review, if they've got any rent freeze, are there any peppercorn leases, and all such information that organizations typically negotiate with tenants at the time of negotiating a lease document. It is very important to capture those because if we have all the key commercial terms captured in an accurate way that can be presented in a simple table, it will help us in creating a cash flow model which can be used for analyzing whether it's worth investing in a lease, what kind of incentives or freebies can we give to a tenant, can we put in capex, and ultimately what returns can we make on that lease. Moving on to the next slide, why is cleaning the tenancy schedule very important for modeling? So there's six key reasons, and I'll touch upon each of the reasons. One is ensures data integration. If we don't clean up the tenancy schedule and make sure it's presented in the right tabular format, what that basically does is it restricts our ability to model the cash flows accurately. And in my career so far, I've seen that, no two leases are standard, while, there's some degree of standardization that organizations typically tend to adopt, but each lease would have its own nuance, and it's very important to capture those nuance information to be able to model the cash flows accurately. So a typical example of such a nuance could be when is the next rent review date. It could just vary across all the leases if we are offering any rent freeze to the tenant. So it is very important to ensure that our data is integrated to be able to model accurately. The next key benefit is it helps to reduce errors. If our underlying data, underlying rent roll is well presented, we can draw meaningful insights out of it and minimize the chances of making mistakes when we are modeling cash flows. The third one is minimizing the risk of misleading results or improving decision making. This is something that I'll show when we actually move to the Excel segment of this webinar, where how we can draw meaningful insights from a rent roll, which can aid in decision making in terms of whether we like the rent roll, whether we would like to invest in the property based on the information available on the rent roll or not. Fourth is around increasing efficiency when building a model. It's the most common it's the most common rule of thumb in financial modeling, where if the underlying data is well laid out, it just improves the efficiency of the modeler in terms of building the model. You can build a very flexible and automated model which can capture any scenarios. There's always a temptation to do hard coding to capture certain nuances. I strongly discourage against that, because when you are dealing with multi-tenant buildings, it can really hamper your model and be more time consuming in the longer term. Next one is ensuring compliance and reporting accuracy. So whichever organization you work with, there are certain formats, pre-agreed templates for investor reporting. And if your model is automated, you can create those templates, which are all formula links. So all of that becomes pre-populated. So the minute you prepare your cash flow model, all the investor reporting metrics are automatically captured. And the last one is data analysis for financial decision, whether we should be leading to a tenant, whether it's compliant with our business plan, and helps us to meet the targeted returns. What are the common issues in rent roll? Often what you see is when vendors or the sellers share the rent roll for any asset classes, the common themes are data entries are missing. So for example, lease start date or lease end date might be missing, or not all of the terms might be captured. There are a lot of inconsistencies and formatting issues. So for example, when we look at our Excel, the PDF document and the Excel, the parking rent is provided as remarks in one of the columns rather than in highlighting, okay, each unit has X number of parking and X number Y number of Y rent, so that by multiplying the two, we can estimate the income. So it's very important to clean up those issues to be able to model effectively. There are often duplicate entries, so it is very important to make sure that we thoroughly review the rent roll and spend some time putting it in the right format that helps in modeling, else we'll end up double counting some of the cash flows. Lease terms could be inconsistent or incorrect. There could be errors in calculation. So this is again something I'll show you when we pull data from PDF. Usually all the numbers that we pull are hard coded. I think it's a good practice to spend some time building the right formulas and making sure that the arithmetical accuracy of the hard coded numbers are correct. You'll often find there are some empty or unclear column headers. In that case, I'd usually recommend going back to the seller or the consultant or the vendor, whoever is selling the asset, to request for the lease information, which is missing. In this case, the example that we use for the second half of the webinar, I've made some assumptions to be able to show you how that's done. And reviewing the rent roll will help us to identify any data outliers. And it's very important to confirm whether those data outliers are correct or not, because if we don't uh, understand the outliers, our metrics could be all over the place. Now we'll move to a case study. Before going to the case study, what I would typically show is so what we typically receive in a leasing scenario is this is a information memorandum where a vendor or a seller might be willing to sell a building. And if we go to the page 14 of this document, this is the tenancy schedule. Now, as you can see, this tenancy schedule is in PDF and it captures all the data that we just discussed. Tenant, which floor they are on, area, lease start date, review, what's the contracted rents for the ERV. ERV basically means the estimated rental value to the market rent if it were to be leased today. Now, there are two options. One option is we get someone in our team to manually input these data points into a spreadsheet. One, that is very time consuming and inefficient. And second, it is prone to human errors. The second option is we use something called the get data function. So, Sonia, can you confirm if you can see my screen? Yes, excellent. So, to use the get data function, come on the Excel, you go to the data tab, you go to that get data. Once you're on get data, you go to from file, and in our case, it's from a PDF. I select PDF. I select the underlying file. So when I select the underlying file, this will load. We give it time for it to load. It's still quite efficient, despite it takes a few seconds or maybe up to a minute to load. Now it tells me what page I want to pull. So I know that the table I want to pull is on page 14. So I double click on it and we provide it another further time to load. Once this is done and I can see that all the relevant columns are getting captured, all I'm going to do is close and load. And then the Excel will do its job where it will automatically pull all the data from a PDF in a Excel spreadsheet, which is tabulated, as you can see. So this is reflecting everything that was in PDF on page 14. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the sidebar. Now, some of the common issues and problems that we discussed with the rent roll. So, while it saved me a lot of time, I think there's a lot of problem with these rent rolls. So let's talk about a few common issues with the with this rent roll that I've kind of fixed over here, which is something that I did before as a preparation to this webinar. So the first thing is I've put commas based on thousands. It just helps me to read the numbers better, which is I think which which is quite helpful. The the second thing that I would do is I would make assumptions for now on the missing data. Uh, in real life, whosoever has shared the data with you, whether it's the vendor or the seller, you can request the missing data from them. I think it's very important to request this missing data to be able to model accurately. Third, what I do is this is something I've not captured as a part of my refined rent rule analysis because we just have 30 minutes webinar where 25 minutes I will present and 5 minutes for Q&A. But what I would do is so in column L, you can see various terms have been summarized. So for example, for the first tenant, rent is a peppercorn on first month immediately after fifth, sixth, and seventh anniversary. So what I would do is I would create columns and add the dates over here where the rent would be peppercorn rather than having it in a qualitative way. Because if I can put the dates over here when I go about modeling my cash flows, it would just make the process much more efficient. So every time where there's a nuance in a lease, even if it's specific to just one lease in the entire rental, I'll prefer adding a column, have it blank for rest of the other tenants, but capture that nuance term in a separate cell to be able to model accurately. And after adding those, the commas, adding requesting the missing information, summarizing the qualitative comments in tabular format to be able to convert them into cash flows. What I've done is I would spend some time refining this rent roll in a much neater way, which helps me to build my financial cash flows and do some initial analysis. So let's see in terms of what have we done over here. So anything that's in blue, that's an input. So when I say input, this information was provided to me in the rent roll. Obviously, in some places you'd see that. So, for example, the fourth floor part B, if you see in the original rent roll, there is nothing in the lease expiry date. I have assumed that I've called the vendor or the seller and requested this information. So I have all the lease start and lease expiry dates and to be able to model effectively. Now, one thing you'd notice what I've done over here, which is I think a really good practice. I've got certain things in blue and certain things in black. Now, things that are in blue are essentially the input or the assumptions which I am driving. Things that are in black are formula driven. So again, one of the common pitfalls or the common issues with converting rent roll from PDF to Excel is all these numbers over here, which is the rent per annum or the ERV per annum, they're all hard coded as you can see over here. What I have done, I said, okay, I know the rent per square feet, which I've linked to the page which was converted from PDF, but then I've made this formula driven where I said, let's multiply this rent with the area to make sure there is no arithmetical inaccuracy in the data provided in the PDF. Because sometimes when the vendors or sellers are providing the data, I would be surprised if there could be errors in some occasions. The next thing that I added for the analysis and for analyzing the rent roll is something called the VAL. VAL is the weighted average life of the lease, and weighted average life of the lease is calculated based on the lease start date, or the in this case I've taken the lease start date, or you can calculate it from the current date and the earlier of the lease break date or the lease expiry date. The reason we are choosing the earlier of the lease break date or the lease expiry date is because those are the dates at which tenant had the right to terminate the lease. Before that, tenant by law cannot break the lease and they are obliged to pay you rent. What this metric does is this metric tells the investors the extent to which a lease or a particular building might be de-risked. So, for example, in this case, some tenants are logged in for 12 years, some are logged in for 5 years, but on an average, I can see tenants are logged in for nine years. What that implies is my cash flows over here are fairly de-risked, as for 9 years, I don't have to worry about void risk. The existing set of tenants will keep paying me rent because they can't really leave the building. Yes, one needs to assess the credit risk. If the tenant goes bust, you'll be in a different scenario altogether. But for the purposes of our modeling, let's just assume these are institutional grade, A grade tenants where credit risk is not a risk. The next important aspect that I'd like to highlight over here is how to calculate VAL, which is the weighted average life. So at a lease level, what I've done is I've said if G4, which is my break date, is equal to 0, that is, if there is no break, then give me the difference between the days between the expiry date and the start date. But if the difference between the break and the expiry date is less than 0, which basically means that the tenant has the right to break the lease before the end of the lease, then give me that date. And based on that, I've calculated what is the val in years for each of the tenants. Now, this is the average val. One of the common mistakes that I've seen analysts across different organizations do is when they want to calculate the average, they'll just calculate a simple average. Simpler average in this case, as you can see over here, is 8.3. What we need to be very careful with either the val or the rent numbers, they are weighted average. Weighted average implies the weight weight is assigned based on the area taken up by a tenant. For example, uh, I click on something. Sorry about this. Yeah. So for example, in this case, because tenant one, who's on terrace first, second, and sixth floor, has 30,000 square feet, which is probably the highest individual lease, or they occupy roughly 20% of the building, the highest weight is attached to 12 years. That's why, despite having so many leases for 5 or 3 years, because more area is logged in for higher number of years, our our weighted average lease for all the leases is more skewed towards towards the bigger tenant. And it's the same concept for rent, where I've done a weighted average, and all weighted average that is use some product, rent an area, and divide it by the area. There's the same formula on balance. The next thing I do as a best practice again is to do a check. What does a check do? So the rent per annum number over here is just a sum. So we multiply the two numbers, that is the area and the rent per square feet, to calculate the rent per annum. This is a sum. And over here, what I'm doing is if I multiply my area with the weighted average rent, does it come to the same rent that I've achieved by summing the individual leases? The reason I've done this check is it helps me to ensure that my weighted average number that I've calculated is accurate. Moving on to the key operating metrics that I'd like to summarize for the next 3 or 4 minutes before opening up the floor to Q&A. So this is one of the typical ways most institutions summarize the rent roll. So while the table above provides lease by lease detail, but if you want to understand what is happening at the asset level, in this case, I can see the total leasable area in the building is 132,000 square feet. We have leased 132,000 square feet, which means building is 100% occupied. Average rent is 27.2. As a result, the total annual rent is 3.6 million, which is same as we see over here. Then I've added something called average ERV per square feet, which is the expected rental value per square feet. That is 32 pounds per year, which is again coming from here. And as I said earlier, everything is linked. So this table gets updated automatically every time I update the underlying rent roll data. The annual expected rent based on the ERV is about 4.2 million. The reason I want to know my annual expected rent is because I'm trying to understand what is the MTM potential or the mark-to-market potential. What is the mark-to-market potential? Mark-to-market potential is the difference between the market rents and the in-place rents, because some of these leases would have been locked in 5 or 10 years ago when the market rents were lower, and because they're typically locked for 15 or 20-year period, the tenants are paying lower rents by the virtue of having agreed lease in the past, whereas the market having moved significantly since then. So what this says is when these lease expires, I have an opportunity to increase my rental income by about 17 to 18%. One of the key reasons I like looking at this metrics, or most investors look at this metrics, is it tells you whether your asset is over rented or under rented, and helps you evaluate the growth potential. So if this number is zero or less than zero, that would imply that the asset is over rented, and I would be wary about investing in such an asset. Whereas in this case, it's an 18% mark-to-market potential, which means that the asset is significantly under rented. Thus, if I buy based on today's rents, I can achieve significant growth in value by the virtue of the MTM potential this asset has. And the last metric is the average weight, which is the weighted average lease expiry term, and that's 9.3 years, which tells me that the asset is significantly de-risked. And this also tells me that on an average, I will need to hold the asset for about 9.3 years to be able to realize the full 17.8% mark-to-market potential. So that's everything from my side. Hope you find the presentation useful. And I think given we have last 5 minutes, I'll open the floor to Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick. I hope our attendees found this useful. So as mentioned, we have a few minutes for Q&A. I will kick off this Q&A webinar. And my first question to you is, what are the critical red flags to watch out for during the cleanup of the tenancy data?
I think the critical red flags to watch out during the cleanup of the tenancy data is first is the missing information. Second is the outliers. Third is the arithmetical accuracy, because a lot of times you might have rent per square feet as 10 pounds, area is 100 pounds, but the total rent might be 2,000 pounds. So I would always make sure those things are formula driven. The fourth thing is data inconsistency or duplicate entries. And the fifth, I would say, is ability to summarize qualitative information such as parking income or any other ancillary income, or nuances such as specific rent-free dates in a tabular format by adding columns, so that we can easily use them on a lease by lease basis for financial modeling purposes.
Great. And so when you are cleaning obviously you have given us already a demo, but when you are cleaning the data, how do you prioritize your task? Do you focus on formatting first and then you're doing the kind of formulas? How do you structure your tasks?
So the way I structure my task, and that's a very good question. So first, I focus on formatting, because until the data is neatly presented, it's very difficult for me to make sense of it. So what I would do, the first thing I would do is I'll think of, okay, what all columns do I need? So I'll set out the relevant columns in a table. So I know that this is the information I need to capture to be able to build a model. Once I have set out the key field, then I start linking it to the underlying rent roll that we derived using the get data function from a PDF, and then look for missing information. Now, any places where I can achieve a number using a formula such as, the annual rent or the whale. I would build in the relevant formulas over there. And the fourth thing I'll do is I'll make sure all my assumptions are in blue and the formulas are in black, so that anyone who looks at my model knows what are the inputs and what are the outputs. So these are the four steps that I typically follow to be able to, build my rental from scratch.
Thank you, Nick. And just from your own experience, have you ever like inherited a model where you can see that maybe the tenancy schedule hasn't been that well cleaned up and has impacted your the outcome of your model or the accuracy of your model? Have you experienced that?
All the time, all the time. When you inherit a model, so give you example and I'll explain this, answer this with an example. There's a common tendency for people to hard code in the model to save time in the short term. So, for example, say if you have a tenancy schedule with 100 tenants in place, and suddenly you get one tenant where you've agreed that every fifth year you'll offer 1 month of rent free. Now, no, none of the other 99 tenants have it. What is very tempting for analysts to do is they go every 5 years, they're manually hard code a zero rent over there or put in a rent free. What they won't appreciate is if they want to run any sensitivity analysis or scenario analysis, they won't be able to do it because of hard coding. So how I would approach it differently or encourage people to do is I'll add different columns, even if it's just for one tenant. I'll leave it blank for the tenants. Add the dates of rent free and link it to the formula so that every time I'm doing any sensitivity analysis, my model is fully automated and is capable of throwing out any scenario analysis or sensitivity analysis that my organization or I might need to be able to make an informed decision.
Right, thank you, Nick. You have answered all my questions. Actually, you just moved this last question, obviously linked to our next webinar next week, where we are going to be trying to use best practices on a kind of a messy model to make sure people understand what what layout, what kind of best practices in formatting and formulas will work best. So I don't have any questions from our attendees. Also, another thing I wanted to mention is when you use get data, obviously, we have just for our attendees to know, we're using Microsoft 365. If you have a Mac, this get data function doesn't work. So you're going to have to find other ways to input your data. Because obviously we have done this on one of our courses, and we know with Apple of Macs, this function is just not there for Excel. Yeah. Right. Okay. So we don't have any questions. I hope everybody enjoyed the webinar. We will be here next week on Thursday at 1:00. And if you are interested in this kind of content, obviously we do financial modeling in Excel in all of our courses, and we have a Black Friday promotion running. So do please check our website for more information, or if you have any questions, do please send them to me. And I think that's it. Nick, thank you very much for your time. And I'll see you next week. Thank you.
See you next week. Cheers. Bye.